I've very deliberately titled this speech today Australian Manufacturing Under Siege because it is under siege by a combination of the two-speed economy and a short-term political desire to introduce a carbon tax. And that's almost regardless of the economic consequences. And believe me, the economic consequences are huge, and there are dangerous double standards being applied to the carbon debate in this country, and I'll outline why that's the case. But first, let me be very clear. I believe that we should be, as a country and individuals, we should be doing what we can to reduce CO2 emissions. That's an objective I think we can all agree with. But how we achieve it, how we avoid unintended consequences, is at the heart of what I want to say to you today. The Australian manufacturing sector employs more than 1 million Australians, 1 in 10 of the workforce. Every job in manufacturing supports another 2 in the service sector. And critically, those Australian manufacturing jobs are very large employers in regional Australia. We have places like Geelong, Whyalla, Port Kembla, Newcastle, Illawarra, Mornington Peninsula, etc. So, just pausing for a minute, why is manufacturing under siege? Well, the first part of it is because, in simple terms, it's on the wrong side of Australia's two-speed economy. And this is a difficult economic position which is now being exacerbated by the political expediency around a carbon tax. In the two-speed economy, the resources and related sectors are enjoying boom demand and record prices flowing from the explosive growth in emerging economies such as China. And this has been a major driver of Australia's record trade-weighted index, and the relationship, which is indeed the relationship between our export and our import prices. And most economists will tell you there's a very strong relationship between the trade-weighted index and the strength of the Australian dollar. So the resource boom has been the major driver of an Australian dollar that has risen from well below 80 cents a couple of years ago to parity today. In simple terms, that means that Australian manufacturers focused on the domestic market, for them imported competition has become significantly cheaper over the last few years. And on the other side, for manufacturing exporters, their costs in export markets have risen, a significant reduction in competitiveness. But I think it's fair to say that one of the most extreme examples of the effect of the two-speed economy is the Australian steel industry, about which I have particular knowledge and interest. In contrast to many other countries, Australian steel market is completely open. No tariffs, no support, which we don't want incidentally, and more than 20% of the flat steel products in this market have always been supplied by imports. We've seen coal and iron ore material cost inputs over the last few years increase by 400%. And that's important because BlueScope Steel is actually one of the few Australian companies to actually add any value to our raw materials. We transform coal and iron ore into world-leading steel products such as the iconic COLORBOND steel. And a couple of years ago, with the Australian dollar in the 70 to 80 cents in relation to the US dollar, we were very competitive. We were in the top quartile in cost terms of world steel cost efficiency. Today, with the Australian dollar around parity with the US dollar, Australian steelmaking's competitiveness has deteriorated on the cost curve, and it's a very tough environment. Now, I'm not here to complain about these factors. We need to deal with that, and each business has to deal with its own macroeconomic environment. But what is important, that business needs to stand up to ill-considered government taxes that are going to exacerbate that position in very tough times. Let me now turn to carbon tax. We've had a series of policy backflips, and the government has recently changed course yet again. Now it proposes to introduce a tax in a little over 12 months. And this means legislation is probably going to be rushed through in the next few months. What is being proposed is a system that will tax Australian-made goods, but will give importers of those same goods a competitive advantage with no comparable tax payable. At its most simple, the carbon tax will give importers an unfair advantage over Australian manufacturers. To compound that problem, Australian manufactured exports will be taxed while those of our competitors would not. Some say that a form of relief or assistance for emissions-intensive trade-exposed companies will be a cure. It's not. It's simply like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Let's be clear, a carbon tax that's based on the flawed CPRS would be a divisive policy that will create significant upheaval for many businesses, particularly in this energy-intensive trade-exposed sector, and many of those, of course, are in manufacturing. The magnitude of the tax will be enormous. Based on an initial price of $25 a tonne, it would raise about $10 billion in the first year and much more in later years. The implementation of such a tax in its current form runs a high risk of the steel industry reaching a tipping point where it will no longer be viable to maintain the investment in Australia and produce in Australia. That could mean all future investment offshore. The broader impact, though, as the steel industry is integral to manufacturing, would be devastating for Australian manufacturing across the value chain and for working families, particularly in regional areas. So I believe very strongly we're at grave risk of allowing the huge benefits of the mining boom to cloud our judgment about the worth of the manufacturing base and other sectors of the economy. For BlueScope, a tax on carbon produced in steelmaking is absolutely fine, as long as the Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Indians, Russians, Americans, Brazilians and others have a similar tax. But if this is not the case, we will simply transfer the carbon generation to other countries without a carbon tax, and that'll accelerate the hollowing out of Australia's economy. So let's just have a look at steelmaking in China. 10 years ago, China produced 125 million tonnes of steel per annum. Today, it produces 690 million tonnes of steel per annum. That's today 45% of the world's steel. It's an astounding increase. It's an increase of 565 million tonnes per annum in a decade, and that's using the same technology that BlueScope uses. This means today China is producing more than 1 billion extra tonnes of CO2 from steelmaking alone, compared to a decade earlier. That compares to a total Australian steel industry generation of CO2 of about 17 million, not billion, million tonnes. Steel's totally recyclable. Our steelmaking is among the top third of carbon efficiency in the world, and we're a carbon efficient contributor to our community. We make wind towers, water tanks, energy efficient buildings. Many of the people who make these products at steelmaking and manufacturing sites around the country are actually working in green jobs today. But let me be clear, I didn't come here just to sound the alarm, although it's very important that we do, and not just to spotlight the short-term political expediency that could put an entire sector at risk. I believe we must find a solution that doesn't disadvantage manufacturers and exacerbate the two-speed economy. There needs to be an industry sector-by-sector approach combined with incentives for research, solar, wind and other renewable energy sources. A first step would obviously be the electricity sector. To encourage investment in cleaner energy and provide energy security of supply, introduce a carbon price, either a tax or a trading scheme, for the electricity sector only. Compensation would be required for low-income households and for the ET sector. And that would clearly be a matter for the power energy sector, and they would need to be consulted extensively by government. Trade-exposed industries, though, such as steel, should only be brought into the scheme when their major international competitors adopt comparable carbon taxes. There is an alternative approach to this sectoral approach, and it's a border adjustment which gives Australian manufacturing a level playing field. Imports would be taxed, the same carbon tax that's applied to Australian-made goods. Exports would get a rebate. That would be fair and equitable, sounds good, but unfortunately, like a carbon tax itself, it is very complex and it would be very hard to administer. But what is absolutely critical is that Australia doesn't adopt a carbon policy that has virtually no effect on world CO2, but causes major economic damage. And I just repeat what I think our major economic challenge as a country is how to manage the impacts of a two-speed economy and ensure that Australians benefit from a once-in-a-lifetime resources boom. If we get it right, we lock in benefits for future generations. If we get it wrong, the opportunity will be squandered and we run the risk of being a quarry. And I can tell you that under the proposal being put forward by Garneau, there won't be an Australian steel industry in 20 years. And if that's allowed to happen, we'll have sacrificed our industry, thousands of workers, that's my particular concern, by offshoring our CO2 generation and almost certainly we will have increased world CO2.